You're listening to The Adventuring Party, talking about gaming the Irish way.
Welcome to the party. I'm Shane, just Shane.
And I'm still Savage. We'll get
Still
that
Savage, unchanging, and ever consistent.
Constant North Star in the firmament. Never have I wavered, and never am I ever likely to change my desire and taste for plaid shirts or my opinion on anything. Off you go.
That's a little bit contradictory there, Savage, because last time we decided we wanted to talk about generic RPGs tete-a-tete, you were very much in the, Swedish death metal standout RPG mood, and we're poo-pooing all of the Forgotten Realms Greyhawks that I was very badly but very bravely defending.
I think you'll find if you go back and listen to that episode, which I believe was called Generic
Podcast Setting.
Yes, if you go back and listen, really listen, you'll find that what I was actually saying, and I've never really changed this position, is that having had a gutload of death metal, sort of avant-garde fantasy role-playing games tucked into my Christmas stocking, I'm now looking for the palate cleanser I always go to, which is the generic fantasy, which I've always adored and never misrepresented or maligned.
Okay, well, I think this time we might be taking a little bit of a different tack on a non-different topic, because people may remember last time in the 15-minute failure that I did. I was sort of stumbling around looking for ground in which to pitch my post, because I had seen interesting, impassioned arguments in favor of genericness in our RPGs, and I was looking around for desperately in the few scant minutes before the game, before the recording, and I came up short and thus stumbled my way through. Turns out that the article I was looking for is named In Praise of Vanilla Fantasy, which is a very different from generic fantasy in a way that only someone who thinks vanilla isn't good might think. Vanilla is very expensive, by the way. Like, even today when we have it in everything, vanilla pods are still quite pricey. Anyway.
Some segue. Look, I've said I'm sorry, alright? And obviously I'm not sorry about a position I've never changed. And anyone can go back and listen to the record and know that. But look, we've that's our generic gaslighting done. So, yeah, you know what? I think there's a lot to be said for generic settings. We're talking generic settings. Fantasy is where we really kind of our minds go to. But you can have generic anything settings, really, if you think about it.
Yeah, generic space, generic fantasy, generic urban horror or urban fantasy. Is sort of a thing that's sort of coalescing right now.
Oh yeah. I think some of it boils out of recent literary works, but
generic cyberpunk.
There's
a bit of that going around.
There's certainly a baseline from which other cyberpunk stuff departs, and the same for space. Although would I say Stars Without Number might be generic as it gets in terms of space RPGs.
It's rather generic, but it's also very much in. It is more willing to mold its setting to fit the realities of a gaming group, essentially. Right. So, like, the way that the warp drives work is very specifically to get people to jump from system to system and not just turn on the button and drive in a direction. And it's also meant to make sure that they're being aware of their fuel gauges and such. It is trying to get that traveler-esque experience of, we can go anywhere we want, but if we go too far, the gasket will break before we get back home.
The wear and tear of space. An awful lot of nothing can really do a lot of damage to a ship. So why don't you just lay out the thesis on the generic setting while I grab that beer that I promised myself.
Okay, so just to go back to the article that sort of inspired this, there's the concept of the lingua franca, the universal language of the generic setting, as that it is a touchstone that everyone understands the terminologies of. This has been talked about before in literary circles as the concept of fantasy land. In between the publishing of Lord of the Rings and the popularity of D&D, there's sort of a mental image of what a fantasy setting looks like has been sort of built is the wrong word. I want to use the terminology used for creating stalagmites, accretion and such. It's a sort of grew like coral onto the popular culture. The idea of the generic feudal but not too feudal medieval European-esque setting with elves in the forest and dwarves in the mountains and all this. And that's sort of, I think, one of the underappreciated elements of a game. And I think it's underappreciated because it's one of those things that a big fan or an artistic leading GM, let's say, an artistic leading GM is looking for, well, I need to stand out in the crowd. I need to show that my setting has got all this thought into it, and it's not generic all the way through. Feudalism is dead. It's all about the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth or some such.
Everyone teleports everywhere. It's magical stuff. It's great.
Yeah, but they sort of do that thinking that they're trying to stand out from their peers, and they're often forgetting that by stepping away from the tropes of the setting, they're stepping away from these touchstones that a newer player might be very reliant on. Like if you take away the common popular cultural stepping stones from your game, the players will end up lost. You can see this an awful lot with the very weird fantasy that's been coming out lately. OSR stuff and is one thing, is that a lot of it just seems very weird and aggressive in some ways, because it doesn't have the authors are in such a rush to show how standout and crazy their settings are that they haven't done the work of, well, the players need to start with their feet on the ground so that they have somewhere to base the weirdness on.
Yeah, so I think the accretion, the stalagmite or stalactite metaphor is correct here. Because really, you can't step away without putting one foot on it to begin with. Yeah. So you do have to, and most of the games you talk about might step, and I think it is 1 foot off, which is grand. It gives you a wider stance, you're more stable. But it is about keeping enough of the norms there so that players can understand why your game is different. Most fantasy games that purport to have anything different about them are not like other fantasy games, are really just a thin layer of sediment being added to the now rock hard accretion that is the underlying generic of fantasy. As for where it all comes from, I think much like rock formations deposited, it goes back a long way. And the generic fantasy you're talking about, you mentioned, what did you mention? You mentioned
Lord of the Rings. Yeah.
But that's, for me, I think you need to go a bit further back to like the folklore of Central Europe. The Hans Christian Andersen, so if you drop anybody into a fairy tale, you're essentially dropping them into a setting that's an awful lot like a generic D&D or generic fantasy setting. Like there's that expectation that there'll be woodsmen and witches and talking animals and stuff like that, and but grounded in feudalism, and the peasants from the fields and the knights are valorous, and the wizards are spooky, mysterious. But that is built up from centuries of shared folklore that immediately anybody who finds themselves inside a story like that could go, right, don't eat any apples, don't make any deals with very small men, find a Prince Charming as fast as possible, and look really carefully at your granny before you go to give her a peck of the cheek. It's that stuff is what generics are made of, and it's so deeply ingrained in in Western culture. And of course, if you go east, you'll find other generics. Perhaps they have... Now, Disney, I think, is the other thing that plays a big part in kind of grinding all of that up fine and serving it up in a very sort of easily digestible format. So any sort of Snow White or Cinderella that you've seen, the films of the Disney movies, again, sort of, there's no specific place, it's no specific time, it's sometime in the past when the palace was magnificent and the balls went down all night and the dwarves are in the mountains and the elves in the forest, etc., etc. It's all there, and it's all, I mean, it codifies all of that for generations now of role players who very easily snap into, oh, well, I understand that if we appear before the king, we should bow, and, you know, we should probably keep an eye on anyone who's got Grand Vizier on their CV, things like that. And so I don't mention Disney or Hans Christian Andersen to infantilize or denigrate that work, because it's actually, it makes it so easy to talk about any other new concept you want to add to that world, or just anything else that players need to know about generic fantasy, where it steps away from Hans Christian Andersen and folklore and Disney cartoons. Gygax was essentially, you know, he was the brave avant-garde sort of creator when he came up with this stuff, but he was relying just as heavily on those touchstones. And he was making changes. He was bringing in Vancian magic, and he was bringing in races that might not necessarily have featured so heavily until that point. So yeah, I think there's I've got a lot of time for. I realize I'm a complete hypocrite now, but I have a lot of time for generics because they provide such an easy gateway to great role playing games.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the thing, is the gateway, the permissiveness, the ability for someone to find themselves and say, well, I guess my wizard lives in a little hut in the woods made from a giant pumpkin or something. Or, you know, I guess my fighter works for the king or is a mercenary. And I think that sort of melange status, which the sort of, you know, throw everything in, people, you know, artistic, I don't want to be sounding anti-pretentious here, but like, you know, for all people complain that that's ahistorical or nonsensical in a world that's magic and stuff, the primary point of that is to create that touchstone to get people in the door. They understand that, you know, this is a medieval village, and, you know, if there's goblins in the woods, that's probably a bad thing for the village, and, you know, it's this easy thing. Now, recently there's sort of been a point that, you know, maybe this whole fantasy thing is maybe not as generic as some people, not for everyone, and it's not quite the cultural touchstone that people might think it is. Yeah,
and honestly, my response there is, okay, I want yours then. Bring it on. Let's see what the generic folklore of the sort of subcontinent is, or the Far East. Can we still call it the Far East? Or Africa. Africa's got great folklore and loads. Or we saw it. And do you know what? Disney does great work here again. Hands up who saw Moana and learned a whole bunch of probably slightly wrong things about Polynesian folklore. And that setting you could easily... Actually, TSR did a lot of good work on this back in the day. There were a lot more settings that were inspired by things like the Arabian Nights and Chinese mythology that we don't really get to see those products today. I think there's probably, of course, the fear of doing it wrong. But how hard would it be to find those creators and kind of give them a boost up? I do think there is a recent enough fantasy Africa setting.
I think it's actually made by Stars Out. Well, it's actually a couple, I think about it. But the one that comes to mind is Spears of Dawn by the creator of Stars Outnumbered, Kevin Crawford. So that's one that comes to me. I think there's a couple more have been coming out.
He's your homie, isn't he?
I'm just most familiar with him, but I know there's been a few more. I would definitely look up Afro Fantasy on Drive-Thru RPG and DM's Guild, and you'll probably find quite a bit more than you're expecting.
Plenty of it there, and well worth seeking the stuff that is coming from creators who have a background or you know, have done proper research rather than sticking because you don't want to. I've praised Disney a couple of times, but you don't really want to start using Disney's mashup as the basis for your, slightly serious portrayal. That's the wrong way around of doing this. You can't regurgitate, or you can't do the opposite of chewing something up and then spitting it out kind of whole. Help. So where did that go?
That's what birds do.
But yeah, to your point about being sort of maybe not so inclusive, okay, fine, hands up. Probably not. We'd like to see. I'd be massively interested in reading some more, which I'll probably fold into my ongoing commitment to read less D&D and more other things this year. But we'll talk about that on a future episode. Okay, but you were saying that there's this threat of there's this potential pitfall where it's very Middle Europe, medieval.
Yeah,
that's as the baseline generic.
We sort of touched on this on a previous episode about medievalism and how it tends to be a lot weirder than we give it credit for, and that's part of the criticism of the vanilla fantasy is that bringing out the general details of all of Europe when you drill down to specific countries or religions or such, you get an awful lot of nice, chewy, standout stuff that can be fodder for all kinds of things. And that's definitely true, but I feel like there's nothing wrong with getting the baseline to get your players grounded, and then start, the next town over they have, a different religion, or next town over they have a weird accent, and then just sort of build it up to next town over they're half-dragon ogres. And
as you say, getting specific is a bit like, my setting is different because it's the same thing really. It's by drilling, you're drilling in a different direction, but instead of stepping away, you're going back to the source material and going, that's kind of generic fantasy, but if we are doing fantasy in the Byzantine period or in the Holy Roman Empire, it's a bit more like this specific thing here, and that's great. Like, absolutely, do it. I think there's a real two-way street there. You can pull some things from that and have them still play well in your otherwise generic setting.
And if your players are up for it, like you can very easily get them to come up with the weird things of what's the weird thing about your hometown? What is your hometown? Why is your hometown not quite Fantasyland? Like, if they're willing to, if they want things to be mixed up with it, you can very easily get them to build off of the Fantasyland base and put in some authentic or completely original aesthetics to spice things to their taste. We're using the Fantasyland analogy as the way to make sure we're as open to people as possible, but it also has the other advantage of being able to survive moderate amounts of weirdness very well. So you can. That's the reason why Fantasyland is so good for, my setting is like everyone else's but. Yeah. So, that you can use that to your advantage as well.
Well, we're in the last 10 minutes or so let's kind of talk about how it all works at the table. And that, I think that's the first point, is that what you said is like, things in any given scenario, baseline Fantasyland, players arrive, and you say, you've got the touchstones, and they know to talk to the village alderman, and they know to bow to the king, and they know to pay their herbalist, otherwise bad things happen. But then you kick off the scenario and go, look, it's just like anywhere else you've been, except something is gone wrong, or something's off, or something's not the way it should be. So this is the point of interest, and this is the clue to the players that the game has started, and that here's where this, scenario this way. So it's very useful to have that baseline to compare whatever is going on in this specific instance. It's for some reason all of the brewer's beer is glowing, and we need to find out why. Does beer usually glow? Well, no, it's generally beer. You've had beer every tavern you've stopped in. This beer is different. Let's find out why. So yeah, the baseline is there to shorthand all the other stuff, and give players, I think, an indication of which way the scenario is going to go and what they should probably be looking at specifically, because it's different. What else? What else do we say?
Well, I refer back to my list of 5 big points.
Yes.
One of the other things is that if you have these Fantasyland touchstones, from a GM running a game perspective, that helps because it creates translatability. You can very easily translate, with a bit of mechanical working, translate like a first edition D&D adventure into Pathfinder second ed adventure with a little bit of work. Or you can take something from Earth Dawn and with a little bit of jiggery pokery, you can run it in your 5th ed game, or stuff like that. It's like the translatability, because they all have the touchstones of the Fantasyland. That means that you can get more utility out of your products. And, you know, if someone writes up something for their bespoke, madcap, heartbreaker, indie system, you can say, well, that's all well and good, but I'll just adapt this to my 13th Age game, and I'll be good to go with that. And it's just like, that's sort of because we have these nice, solid, generic tropes, that allows concepts that use those tropes, whether adventuring ideas, settings, stuff, to be very transferable. You can...
Or something as specific as a monster or an NPC, or a class. Let's say a class that does feature in one game and not another. I hadn't thought of that, and that's a really good point. You've got this kind of interoperability that you can, with a little bit of work.
Whereas you compare that to like all these a more weird thing where like everything is tied to a very specific setting, has a very specific lore, and its madcap magic system. It wouldn't be as transferable. It'd be like, well, I guess I can use the art and then make up something fully formed to use my game, but I can't take the concept around.
What are the other big points?
There is the I think we touched on this earlier. When everything is weird, nothing is weird.
Like if you have the Sinestro problem.
Yeah. Was it Sinestro? I thought it was... Sinestro's the Green Lantern villain. I think you're thinking of...
no idea.
I can't remember.
The guy from The Incredibles. The bad guy from The Incredibles.
Yeah, I remember. But,
the first one.
But yeah, it's like, if you are spending all your time just pointing out every brand new original element you're setting, where people eat frogs and the sky is purple except on Tuesdays, except they call Tuesdays Vorbin days for some reason, and you're going all that, you're essentially sort of just driving like a tidal wave of concepts and lore and your players, and nothing will stand out. Everything will just be, well, what's the weird and original thing about this NPC? What's the weird original thing about this dungeon? If you have nothing but bespoke original content with no nothing to bring it back to well-known things, nothing will stand out as being particularly interesting, because everything is interesting and everything demands players interrogate it and ask you, oh, please, GM, spend 10 minutes explaining this concept to us. So it's like,
I've got a lot of time for games like that. Blades in the Dark is one that pops into mind, because so much of the setting is unique and intertwined that you do really have to have a primer to hand to get players up to speed. But
you do, but it is also like, it is also relying on an awful lot of the Victorian street urchin tropes,
I suppose,
as well as
it has a different bag of generics.
Yeah, so like it is on the weirder side of things, but it's still like the fact that everyone who dies turns into a ghost and the sea is full of stars and krakens. That's pretty weird stuff, but it's still,
it's a lot to get across.
The game is still about being a thief who robs people.
Well, I guess there's a difference there between the activities of play and the setting. Like, the activities of play in Blades in the Dark are, as you say, it's a heist movie game, but the setting is off the wall in many respects. Whereas if you've got a generic setting, you can get away with an awful lot of different types of play without having to move too many chairs around. Which is a big strength. You know, you're free to run a heist, you're free to run a murder mystery, you're free to run political intrigue, or to just go dive down a dungeon. All of which sit perfectly well in the setting. It would be a stretch in something like Blades in the Dark to ask the characters to go and investigate a dungeon in the wilderness. because there isn't one. Like there isn't a wilderness worth speaking of. You'll die out there. Stay in the city. So it is constrained in terms of the types of games you play there because the setting is so weird. Whereas generic, you've got a lot more options. Right. Yeah. What's next?
Next one is a bit more of a. Don't want to call it cynical, but vanilla fantasy might just be what people actually want, and I think this is coming back to the accepting newer players. And I think this is partly accepting new players, but also accepting, busier players who don't really want to spend, mass amounts of brain cells on the lore and, cool things of your bespoke setting. Is that they may just want to be Thugnor the Barbarian who bashes doors and then gets drunk in the tavern afterwards. But yeah, I think the idea is just like vanilla fantasy, the process of accretion happens for a reason, is that people find themselves responding well to the tropes that survive the days. Like when the edges get sanded off, there's something pleasing there. And you don't want to discount that just because, well, I've played 57 games of D&D, all in the same generic blah setting. Clearly everyone else also wants to do something massively original that no one's ever seen before. And it's just like, well, you need to be aware that if you're taking on 3 new players and 2 old veterans who've been out of the gaming community for 10 years and just want to get into the old style again, they may very well be in the market for it's D&D, Greyhawk, turn left for Greyhawk, turn right for Forgotten Realms. They may be up for that. They may not want the extra load of bespoke originality. They may want to immerse themselves in vanilla fantasy settings the same way people like drinking Coke. Like, it might not be tremendously original or super artistic, but ask yourself why you're running the game. Are you running the game to make people happy?
That's a very good point, and it's sometimes overlooked in this kind of theory bashing. Making people happy. Like, you can do an awful lot with a group of players, but if you can't entertain them and generally have them happy to show up, then they're just not going to be there. And as you say, a familiar setting where they don't have to think too hard, because their players are notoriously lazy swine when it comes to unique backgrounds. Plop 15 pages of background on a setting in front of your players, see what happens. One will read it. The others were like, yeah, I totally read that. We still kill orcs, right?
Yeah. I generally take, when I'm running a setting, I tend to go to the thing of, well, let's start with, the general outlay of it, and as the weird stuff, because, like, as we brought up last time, even something like Greyhawk, once you scratch the surface a bit, there's quite a bit of weirdness scattered around in the nooks and crannies of, just because nooks and crannies of Greyhawk, just because the most of the land is this sort of semi-generic medieval fantasy with goblins and wizards, doesn't mean that there isn't some really weird stuff like the radioactive cave of Lum, or the empire of the demigod of pain and suffering. You go looking around. Once people are grounded and ready for the weirder stuff, often the weirder stuff will be there. But
does it ever have to be? I mean, is it completely? There's an awful lot of sort of making exceptions that we've talked about, but I mean, is it perfectly acceptable to simply just run it as generic fantasy and not have to worry that it's going to be horribly unfashionable or just sort of forgettable? Is there something to be said for, like, I never really
it doesn't
worried.
It doesn't strike me as the kind of thing you need to commit to, though. If your players start off wanting vanilla fantasy and they end at level 27 wanting vanilla fantasy, that's fine. But maybe they'll get 3 sessions in, say, okay, we know what we're doing now, let's do something weird, while the GM while the options, then you can run off and go into all kinds of plane hopping reality twisting adventures there.
Of course,
like,
yeah.
The thing is, if you start weird, it's a lot harder to go vanilla than it is to start vanilla and then go weird.
Yeah, the other advantage of generic setting, of course, is that all weirdnesses can be localized. As I say, it's just that cave that's radioactive. It's just this town that worships frogs. Like, it's, and if it doesn't work, move on.
Exactly.
Cross the border and you're back into what you know pretty much instantly. You mentioned 5 points. Have we hit all of them yet?
There's one more, and this is a bit more of the person who wrote this list is, an independent publisher of fantasy and OSR style games. So this is probably a bit more personal to him, but they make fantasy so that you don't have to, is his final point. They make vanilla so that you don't have to. We don't have to, in his case. It's this idea of, Forgotten Realms is this sort of very generic setting. Greyhawk's very generic setting with this sprinkling of weirdness here and there, and it's all very medieval and all very Lord of the Rings and such and so forth. But that's been made. That's a product that's comes in a tin, no expiration date. But then writers and, of course, GMs, who are writers and game designers in their own right, they can take that and work with it. Like, they don't need to do that work. They have Greyhawk in their old PDFs, or they have their copy of Waterdeep Dragon Heist to give them Waterdeep as a setting. They have the stuff to go on based on that, and they can go all kinds of direction with it. It's been made for you. The generic fantasy setting is made for you, and then from that, you can put in the work that you want to do it. Maybe your work is just as generic and passé as their work, or maybe it's something blindingly original. That's fine. The point would be that you don't need to do extra work to create the generic vanilla setting unless you want to, unless making that means something for you. Don't just make a whole bunch of fancy kingdoms and towns and elf forests just because you feel you have to. Just make the bits that you want to do and plop them into a generic setting, and then see how the players respond to them. You don't need to do that grunt work if you don't want to.
Wise words. Probably a good place to leave it for now. As you say, a good GM, a smart GM, does as little as possible. So your players are going to do most of it anyway, so just sit back and be prepared.
And players may be looking for the weird vampires at the table, or they may be happy just, drinking with the local drunks and making jokes about goblins. That's a discovery you're going to have to make. And it might be a little bit easier for people to get comfortable if you have something generic for them to start from. And who knows where go from there.
Very true. Okay. Well, you want to wrap us up?
Yes. We will use our generic outro to see you folks off. This party is over.
Thank you for listening to The Adventuring Party. If you'd like to leave us a voicemail, you can head on over to SpeakPipe and drop us a line. Or you can join us on our Discord server, where we keep the party going after hours. Otherwise, you can find us on Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or Twitter, or you can email the hosts at party@theadventuringparty.net. The Adventuring Party is released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike version 3 license, but you probably knew that already. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and look forward to seeing you back here next week. Goodbye.